Today we're going to talk about the War of 1812. When we left off last week, after talking about the Lewis and Clark expeditions, Jefferson had just purchased Louisiana Territory, and as a result, he was reelected in 1804. At this time, the British and the French were fighting, and that was causing America some problems because our big industry at that time was shipping, and with those two going to war, there's a lot of issues with us and our shipping across the Atlantic Ocean. The next president after Jefferson was James Madison, and he was elected in 1808, and he struggled with this shipping issue as well. As a result, with this issue with the British, Madison took us into a war against them in 1812. One of the big reasons we went to war against the British is because they were practicing a thing called impressment, where they would take American traders at sea and draft them into their own navy. This was one of the first things that made Americans mad. What made them even more mad is when they found out that the British were actually supplying Native Americans with weapons to fight against us at this time. The war against Great Britain really got started in 1811, and at this time, our territory included all of the original 13 and several new states that entered the Union after the Revolution. The nation also possessed several territories that were added as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. British Canada was still north of us, and Spanish Florida was still in the south. In 1811, the United States forces had defeated, but not quite destroyed, the Indian Confederacy of Tecumseh, leader of Shawnee, at the Battle of Tippecanoe in the Indiana Territory. The battle was a result of growing tension between both the Americans and the Native Americans. In 1812, during the war, the U.S. forces would fight both the British and their allies, the Native Americans. The British were fully invested in the war at this point because they were dealing with Napoleon after the French Revolution over in Europe. The Americans lost many of these early battles against the British, including Fort Dearborn Massacre in Illinois Territory in August, and the Battle of Mackinac in July, and Detroit in August. These victories gave the British good position along the Great Lakes for defending Canada against American invasion. You can see on the map that Canada was still controlled by the British. We can see here that most of the fighting during 1813 took place along the United States and the Canadian border. The British won victories at Frenchtown, which is now in southern Michigan, at that time the Michigan Territory, and that took place in January. Stony Creek took place in June, Chateauguay in October, and then in Chrysler's Farm in November. And it's important to remember that these were British victories. But these victories really in the end were overshadowed by a lot of defeats at the hands of the Americans. And one of the biggest ones is when the Americans went to the British capital at York, which is present-day Toronto, and they took control of that and they burned it to the ground. 1814 was probably one of the biggest years during the War of 1812. In March of 1814, General Andrew Jackson was able to defeat an Indian force at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which is in the Mississippi Territory. And what the importance of that was, is it broke that Indian military presence that was all around east of the Mississippi River at that time. One problem that took place now is that the war in Europe was at an end and Napoleon was really no longer an issue. So what the British did is they could finally shift their focus away from the French and away from Europe and bring it over to North America and shift their focus to the Americans. What they did is they went and they attacked Washington, D.C. in August of this time, and this was really probably the biggest British victory at this war. They were able to burn the Capitol building, the presidential mansion, and other public buildings at this time. What's kind of funny about this war is in 1815, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, and this treaty ended the war between Great Britain and the U.S. It was signed in December of 1814. Because the news of that treaty took so much time to cross the Atlantic Ocean, there's still a lot of fighting that took place, especially in the South. And during this fighting, the Americans actually had one of their biggest victories in New Orleans, and that was actually their biggest victory of the whole war, and it took place after that treaty was signed. One of the important things to remember of this war is there's kind of three results for the Americans. One of them is that it put an end to the Federalist Party. We talked about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists last week, but the Federalists really opposed going to this war against the British, and this war and us signing that treaty ended the Federalist Party. A second result of the war is that it really encouraged the growth of American industries to manufacture products that we couldn't get from Britain anymore because of the war. So things we had got from them, once we went to war, we weren't getting them, so we had to make them ourselves in our own industries. And the third thing it did, probably the most important, is it confirmed the United States as a free nation. After the Revolutionary War, we considered ourselves a free nation, but I think the British still, in their mind, thought that they could control us, and we saw that in this war. But after this treaty, it really confirmed us as a free nation. Later on this week, we're going to talk about some more of America's foreign policy, and then soon after that, we'll get into some of Jackson's presidency. So, if you got all this information, that's good. I hope you took notes. If there's some things you missed, just go back, play it again, especially at the parts you didn't get, and we will discuss this briefly in class.